And now I have the pleasure of introducing today's speaker, the photographer Isa Leshko. As I think many of my students know, I've been anticipating this talk for a really long while. I don't want to represent Leshko's art. I will let Isa represent her own work, but I just want to say that encountering her images and writing shifted my basic premises of how I understand animal agribusiness, which is the topic that I study as a professor here at Tufts. They really kind of instantly pulled the ground out from how I understood something that I had closely examined for well over a decade. So Isa Leshko joins us today from nearby Salem, Massachusetts. Her work has been supported by a wide-ranging array of organizations, including the Bogliasco Foundation and the Culture and Animals Foundation. Her images have been widely featured in public media and newspapers, and her prints are held in many collections, such as the Boston Public Library and the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. Her series, Allowed to Grow Old, was published in a book in 2019 by the University of Chicago Press. And I should note, we will be raffling 3 copies of the book for attendees today. We will follow up with you if your name is selected. But Allowed to Grow Old's images and texts are profound reflections on animal ethics, aging, mortality, and the politics of representing others. As the philosopher Peter Singer states, in Leshko's work, we get to know domesticated animals, not as things to eat or produce milk or eggs for us, but as individuals with personalities and lives of their own to lead. As the writer Gene Stone notes, this is a book that will make you laugh, cry, smile, and I think he's quite right here, and ponder the universe. And as the cultural theorist Carol Adams briefly, eloquently, and so rightly states, there is something new in these gorgeous portraits of the old. Please join me in welcoming Isa Leshko.
Thank you, Alex, for that beautiful introduction. I got chills when you talked about the impact my work had on you or has on you. And whenever I'm having a bad day, I'm going to play back your introduction because it was really beautiful. I also want to thank the Tufts Environmental Studies program and the School of the Museum of Fine Arts for sponsoring this talk. I want to thank Sarah Gomez for her work in coordinating this talk. And I also want to thank you for spending this. It is a gorgeous day here in the Boston area. So thank you for spending your lunch time indoors listening to this talk instead of under a tree enjoying the weather. I'm lecturing today from my studio in Salem, Massachusetts, which is situated on Namkeg, or Fishing Place, where generations of Indigenous people, including the Massachusetts, Pawtucket, and other communities have lived and passed through for centuries. I acknowledge that this is Indigenous land, and I also want to acknowledge the Massachusetts tribe who continue to honor and hold this land into the present. So with that said, I want to, let's see. I apologize. I'm not certain why this is not advancing. Okay, it's my apologies. This is a little bit of a different format from other artists' talks that I've given, because I really wanted to focus on ethical considerations involved in producing animal images and consuming them as well. And so I've divided the talk into 3 parts. There's going to be an introduction to the work, how I came upon the idea of photographing elderly animals, why I gravitated towards farm animal sanctuaries, and what my goals for the work have been, and how they shifted as I worked on the project for nearly a decade. Then I'm going to segue into an overview, a quick overview on the early history of animal photography. That alone could be its own talk, but I just want to give some context before talking about ethical considerations that informed the creative choices that I made for my work, and hopefully will inspire other artists who are working with animals as subject matter. So with that said, I'm going to, this project all began with a chance meeting with a 34-year-old Appaloosa horse named Petey. I met him when I joined my sister for dinner at her brother-in-law's house. The moment I saw Petey, I was just mesmerized by his beauty. He had deep hollows above his cataract-laden eyes, and his back had a deep sway. His coat was dull and coarse. Though he moved stiffly, he followed me and my niece around the pasture, and he was just incredibly gentle and tolerant. My niece and her cousins were quite young, and they were very energetic, and he was completely unfazed by them. So I was just drawn to him, and I knew I had to photograph him. So I ran into the house and grabbed the only camera I had with me, which was a toy camera called a Holga. And I went into the pasture and I photographed Petey for the rest of the afternoon. And I was just, I didn't fully understand why I was so drawn to him, but I just had to keep photographing him. And it had been a long time since I had felt that kind of excitement while holding a camera. For several years, my sister and I had been caring for both our elderly parents. In the span of 18 months, Dad had successfully battled stage 4 oral cancer, and Mom had become delusional and at times violent due to Alzheimer's disease. After a series of crises, we decided as a family that Mom was safest in a skilled nursing facility with a dementia care unit. Finding the right place for her and easing her transition to her new home consumed my energies for several months. And there is a tradition or a rich history of photographers documenting their parents, particularly in declining health. And I didn't feel comfortable doing that for a number of reasons. One is I wanted to be present as a daughter and as a sister as we were navigating this crisis. And I also wanted to, I felt as though my mom couldn't give consent because of her dementia. And that was very much, that was troubling to me. And I didn't feel comfortable photographing her under those circumstances. So I really hadn't spent much time photographing or holding or taking pictures during that period. And then when I reviewed my negatives from my afternoon with Petey, I realized I had stumbled upon a way of examining my grief and my fear, examining or stemming from my mom's illness. And I knew that I had to keep photographing old animals. So I searched for local animal sanctuaries in the Boston area, and I discovered Winslow Farm in Norton, Massachusetts, which is closer to Providence. And the sanctuary was very kind in hosting me, and I made several trips there that fall. And these are some early images. Like many Americans, I had never before spent time with farm animals. Although animal-derived products are ubiquitous in this country, farm animals themselves are removed from our daily lives. Meat is marketed in a way that erases the presence of animals. Pig flesh is described as pork, cow flesh, beef. That is by design because it's easier to ignore the ethical implications of consuming animal products if you can forget that they actually come from animals. This realization compelled me to learn more about these animals and photograph them. And through online research, I found that there were other farm animal sanctuaries. So I just want to include, I'm sorry I keep back. um, so these are some early images from the project before I even thought of it as a project. And so I discovered that there's a network of sanctuaries dedicated to rescuing, rehabilitating, and providing sanctuary for rescued farm animals. And the animals at these sanctuaries come from a variety of situations. Some are found wandering the streets after they've escaped from trucks en route to slaughterhouses. Others are rescued from hoarders or backyard butcher operations that got out of control. Many are abandoned during natural disasters or when farmers can no longer feed them. On rare occasions, the animals are beloved pets whose humans can no longer care for them. But most animals come from dire situations. They tend to arrive at sanctuaries gravely ill and require extensive veterinary care. Some do not survive, but ones who do are given a home for the rest of their lives. At these sanctuaries, animals are given ample space to roam freely and indulge in their natural behaviors. Chickens spend their days outdoors, basking in the sun, taking dust baths. Their living conditions are vastly different from those of industry chickens, who are densely packed in windowless, poorly ventilated sheds. On commercial farms, sows are so tightly confined that they can't even turn around. At sanctuaries, pigs explore large pastures and soak in wallows. They sleep curled up together on fresh hay, often snoring loudly. And yes, pigs do snore. Nothing is expected of these animals. Many sanctuaries offer guided educational tours, but the animals determine how much or how little contact they have with visitors. Humans do not consume any products derived from the animals who live at these sanctuaries. Although sheep are sheared for their comfort during the hot months, their wool is left outside for birds to claim for nesting material. Eggs are boiled, crushed, and fed back to hens as a calcium supplement. Animals at sanctuaries are either sterilized or segregated by sex to prevent breeding. But occasionally pregnant animals are rescued. Any milk that they produce is consumed only by their babies, who remain with them throughout their lives. So this is a photo of the welcome sign at Posado Safe Haven in Sultan, Washington, which is one of my favorite sanctuaries that I visited. It's a place that's very dear to me. And the moment I saw this sign, I was weeping, and it really encapsulates what a farm sanctuary is. I should also say that at these sanctuaries, animals are given names and they're treated as individuals. They're given individualized care, and when they pass, they are often memorialized. So this is a memorial garden at Posados, and they have stones commemorating the residents. And some of them are very poignant, like this one. Others are quite funny, like this one. And then there's also an acknowledgement of the animals who never make it to sanctuaries and are never rescued. So initially my approach to the project was examining my fear of aging. My mom had dementia, my grandmother had dementia. I am terrified of getting dementia as I grow older. Anytime I forget my keys or a word is on the tip of my tongue, I freak out. So initially I was thinking of photographing elderly animals as a way of examining and confronting that fear. But visiting these sanctuaries, meeting these rescued animals, I just, I it transformed me. I became a passionate advocate for these animals. I wanted my images to speak on their behalf. And it seems selfish for me to photograph these animals for any other reason. From that point on, I was approaching these images as portraits and not as metaphors that I could project my emotional baggage onto, or symbols. So I endeavored to reveal something unique about each animal that I photographed. And one of my inspirations for the project, my mouse, one of my inspirations for this project was Richard Avedon's unsettling portrait of Marilyn Monroe. And it seems like an odd inspiration, but let me explain. Avedon had spent an evening photographing Monroe as she danced and flirted and was basically Marilyn Monroe. And after their session had wrapped, he observed her quietly sitting in the corner of her studio. Her face was devoid of expression. He grabbed his camera and with her tacit consent, he recorded this rare unguarded moment. The resulting image shows Monroe looking spent and resigned. There's a dullness in her eyes, which is a jarring contrast to the shiny sequins of her dress. Although there's some debate as to whether this portrait reveals the real Marilyn, the image shows a side of the actress that the public had never seen before. It's my favorite image of Avedon because it challenges viewers to question everything they know about Monroe. And I want my images to accomplish the same thing. With these portraits, I want to dispel the stereotype that farm animals are dumb beasts. The animals who appear in this book are sentient beings, or in my project, are sentient beings who think and feel and have distinct personalities. I'm not claiming that they're anthropomorphic barnyard characters in Charlotte's Web, but they do experience pleasure and pain, joy and sorrow, anger and fear. They love their babies and they experience great distress when they are separated from them. Some are shy and reserved, others outgoing and affectionate. Some are loners, others develop close friendships with other animals. When these friends die, they mourn. We cannot know if animals experience emotions exactly the way we do, but that's beside the point. Barbara King wrote in her book, Personalities on the Plate. She's a biological anthropologist and fantastic writer. No animal need be sentient like us to be sentient, just as no animal need be smart like us to be smart, or feel emotions like ours to be known as a feeling being with a distinct and sometimes vivid personality. So for the duration of the project, I continued to focus on elderly farmed animals, but my motivation was different. It is incredibly rare for a farm animal to reach old age. To say that the animals in my project are the lucky ones is a massive understatement. Roughly 70 billion land animals are factory farmed globally each year. It's nothing short of a miracle to be in the presence of a farm animal who has managed to reach old age. Most of their kin die before they are 6 months old. And I hope my images invite reflection upon what is lost when farmed animals are butchered in their youth. And I hope that the images inspire people to make more compassionate choices regarding the foods they eat and the clothes they wear. So that is as brief of an introduction to my work as I was able to squeeze in. And now I want to dive into a very brief history of animal photography. So to back up a bit, I have to say I was never quite comfortable with the power imbalance that exists between a photographer and a subject in portrait photography. So although those in front of the camera can control their facial expressions and their gestures, the photographer determines what is in the frame and when precisely to click the shutter. That photographer also retains power long after the portrait session is over, because the photographer selects which images to print or publish online and how those images should look. In On Photography, Susan Sontag writes, "To photograph people is to violate them by seeing them as they have never seen themselves, by having knowledge of them that they can never have." And photography also has a long association with hunting that casts picture taking in a predatory light. Beginning with the second half of the 19th century, hunters photographed carcasses of animals they had killed to exhibit as trophies. But the earliest animal photos involved taxidermy. This is one of the earliest photos that involves an animal. And because shutter speeds were so incredibly slow back then, taxidermy was used. And the animal is positioned as a compositional element. The photo isn't about the animal. It's about this wild landscape, and the animal, the taxidermy, is used to heighten the sense of wilderness in the image. And then, as I said, hunters also began photographing carcasses of the animals that they had killed to exhibit as trophies. And what's interesting is that some of these were also done as studio images. So a person would come to a studio with a dead animal part and their gun and get photographed. And these images were also taken in the field as well, as you can see. And this tradition continues today, as evidenced by this photo of Donald Trump's sons posing with a slain leopard that had gone viral online during the 2016 presidential election. I also think it's worth noting that these early hunting trophy photos promoted imperialism and white male patriarchy. It was common for the British, for example, to exhibit photos like these, as well as taxidermy of wild predators in government buildings in colonies such as India. It was a not so subtle way of asserting British dominance over the land and their superiority. Wealthy British citizens would also travel to colonies on hunting expeditions and return home with these types of photos that they would exhibit proudly in their homes. As camera technology evolved, and Ottmar Anschutz developed the focal plane shutter in the late 1880s, cameras became fast enough to record animals in motion. By the next decade, photographing wildlife became a popular pastime known as camera hunting. Conservationists during that era billed this pursuit as a sport that required more skill than traditional hunting. But camera hunting didn't replace actual hunting because often animals were killed shortly after they had been photographed. And this image that I stumbled upon recently actually just completely exemplifies this relationship between hunting and photography. So this history, though, is why we talk about cameras as though they're guns. When you take a picture, you aim your camera at your subject and you shoot it. I had never considered the violent connotations of this jargon until I began photographing animals. The first time I had asked a sanctuary director whether I could shoot her elderly residents, I was mortified. I turned bright red. We had both laughed, but I had vowed to never use that term again. And anthropocentrism is the belief that humans are superior to other living entities on Earth. This pervasive idea is used to justify the exploitation of animals, plants, and other natural resources to benefit humankind. The earliest animal photos reinforced anthropocentric cultural norms. And sadly, much of animal photography since then continues to do so. Although animals have been depicted widely in photography, most of these photos are not about the animals themselves. Instead, photographers often look at animals in order to better understand themselves and the human condition. In these images, animals are used as proxies to explore themes such as lust and mortality, as I had originally done when I began my project. In other images, animals are treated as objects. These representations of animals reinforce the anthropocentric idea that animals only have value in terms of what they provide humans. And another common approach is to treat animals as humans. And this is considered a way of showing oftentimes these types of images are billed as, look at animals, they're just like us. But that too carries a certain arrogance because it's not respecting who the animal is and instead trying to put the animal in this human box. So with that and this very brief introduction, I want to dive into the creative choices that I made for my work. And the ethical considerations that informed these choices. So as I mentioned, I had approached these images as portraits. I treated each animal as an individual. I wasn't interested in creating a pretty cow photo. I wanted to create a portrait of Bessie, for example. I did this because I wanted viewers of my images to appreciate that the animals that I photographed are sentient individuals with distinct personalities. To that end, it was essential that the animals I photographed were relaxed in my presence. Rescued farmed animals are trauma survivors. Many are rightfully wary of strangers. It often took several days to develop a comfortable rapport with the animals I photographed. Typically, I spend a few hours lying on the ground next to an animal before taking a single picture. This helped the animal acclimate to my presence and allowed me to be fully present as I got to know her. Consent was also essential to my process. Although animals can't sign model release forms like humans do, they do communicate very clearly when they want to be left alone. If an animal seemed frightened or upset by my presence, I would immediately stop approaching him. I might return a few hours later and try again, but if I received the same response after a few of these encounters, I respected their wishes and left them alone. The animals controlled how they were photographed and where they were photographed. The animals were never posed. I followed them wherever they wanted to go. I also kept my equipment to a bare minimum, so it wasn't threatening. And that means I worked with available light, which is often challenging in dimly lit barns. I tried using reflectors, but they were distracting to animals, and especially goats, for example, who wanted to chew on them. I quickly learned to leave my camera bag outside of the enclosures. It was also important to me that I photograph the animals at eye level, approaching them as if I were a fellow pig or chicken or sheep. I think photographing animals from above is disrespectful and arrogant, and I wanted the viewers of my images to look directly into the eyes of my subjects and have an intimate experience with them. I also have exhibited these images as small prints. They're size 9 by 9 inches because I want to encourage viewers to come up and approach these images closely. and have an intimate encounter with them. So I am running over time. How are we doing, Alex?
I think you've got a good 6, 8, even 10 minutes if needed. As long as we can end, go to Q&A at 12:45 would be great.
Okay, great. It was essential that I also respected the dignity of the animals while photographing them and while editing my images from our portrait sessions. Humans are self-conscious about their age and appearance in ways that animals are not. So I mentioned that my mom, I chose not to photograph her. And one of the reasons why was that she was very self-conscious about her appearance before going out in public. And I knew she would never want to be seen in such a vulnerable and sick state. Some animals do disguise signs of illness and camouflage themselves to avoid being easy prey. Many species alter their physical appearance to attract mates, but that doesn't mean that animals are self-conscious about their appearance in the same manner that humans are. Nonetheless, while editing and photographing the animals for this project, I carefully considered whether I was being respectful to the dignity of the animals I photographed. And one example of this involves Buddy, who was surrendered to the Catskill Animal Sanctuary when his guardians could not properly care for him after he lost his sight. He had endured debilitating panic attacks, and it took months of training for him to overcome them. He suffered significantly from iritis. Because he was already blind, his eyes were removed because it was the most humane way of treating this painful condition. I confess that I was very uncomfortable when I first met Buddy. I had been around many blind animals before, but I've never before had been in the presence of one who had both eyes removed. And then I spent the morning watching Buddy, and I appreciated that there was so much more to him than his disability. I watched him frolic in his pasture with other horses who were not blind, and he seemed as happy and playful as they were. I watched him interact with staff and at the sanctuary, and he was very affectionate with them, and he would run whenever they came near him because he was hoping for treats or affection. It was clear that he loved his life and he loved his friends, both fellow horses and his caregivers. So I wanted to create an image that showed how much Buddy enjoys his life. And I selected this image showing him seemingly peaceful and orienting towards the warm sun. It was important to me that the image be beautiful because I wanted the viewer to have the same realization that I had after spending time with Buddy, that he loved his life, that he was a survivor, and that he should not be pitied. I had taken images of Buddy that were closer crops of his face, and I ultimately chose not to use them. They felt exploitative to me. I endeavored to create a portrait that respected his dignity. And another thing that I wrestled with in the project along these lines was that a number of the animals I met, because they were old, they lost a lot of teeth and they drooled a lot. So I wrestled with whether to include the drool in the images or Photoshop them out. And ultimately I chose to include them because I realized that by focusing on that aspect, and I was imposing my own anthropocentric norms on these animals. I wanted to respect the fact that my subjects are non-human animals and they are not humans in fur and feathers. So that is, and with that, I think we can dive into our talk, Q&A.
Thank you so much. we have a number of questions there flowing in. Yeah, I think we'll start with Kathleen Ney. More of a comment than a question, but it's so interesting that Piscator image was printed on albumin silver. Albumin comes from eggs. And I was also thinking with some of the images with silver gelatin and so forth. And I was wondering if you had reflections on the long history, not only of animal photography, but of the kind of photographic media and tools and the way they've been in a sort of circuit with animal industries.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that photographic media, such as film and prints, gelatin silver prints, for example, use animal-derived ingredients. But that is true for so much in our culture. I mean, for example, when I was working with the University of Chicago Press on publishing my book, I had asked that no animal ingredients be used in the production of the book. And the designer was amazing, and she spent a lot of time researching whether she could find an adhesive that was plant-based. And apparently that does not exist, at least not at the quality that was needed to keep this book bound. And so ultimately we did use that adhesive, but that can be said for pretty much all the books that you have in your library. It is impossible, sadly, to exist in this world without exploiting animals. But to your point, yes, the early history of photography and even contemporary photography does use animal-derived ingredients. With digital technologies, that has changed, but it's really hard to exist in the world without exploiting animals.
We have a question coming in from the Tufts Civics semester students in northern New Mexico. And
Hi.
One of their questions is, I noticed that many of your pictures are in black and white. I'm wondering about the role of color in your work and what your thought process there entailed.
That is a good question. I just from my earliest work in photography, when I was taking intro classes, I gravitated towards black and white. And so I kind of see and process or frame images, thinking in terms of their tonal values. And with these images, I also think that color would have been garish. I think the images may have been a little too much about the artifacts of aging and less about, and that would distract the viewer, I think, from what I was also trying to convey, which is the personality of the animals that I photographed. And I also wanted these images to be really beautiful. Even though to some extent that's controversial in contemporary art, certain circles of contemporary art. But one of my inspirations for this project, or creative inspirations, is Richard Nizrosh. And he photographs industrial pollution sites and creates these gorgeous images of horrific things. And part of the reason, or the main reason why he does that, is he uses beauty to draw viewers to the images. And then once they're there, they can contemplate what is going on. And so I took a similar approach with these images.
Thank you. So I have a quick yes or no question, and then I have a question that's definitely not a yes or no. From Deb Dutra, is it okay if I tweet a few of the images from your presentation? Of course, crediting you. Thanks. Such a lovely presentation. Oh. And this is from a photographer who works in human aging research communications.
Yes. And there was a whole section of my discussion on the consumption of animals online that I ended up cutting out because of time. Yes, but I do have a lot of thoughts about the way, how social media has changed the way we engage with images, but that could be a topic for another talk.
So I've got a big question here, and then we're going to go to the live, to Sarah Gomez's screen on with the live audience. So this is coming from both Zoe Schoen and the students in New Mexico. From Zoe, how do you arrive at an idea of what is dignified or undignified in the absence of verbal consent, and when, it seems to me, so much of what we might feel is quote unquote indignified in an image is rooted in the forms of violence you are actively working against, such as anthropocentrism and ableism. And the bigger add-on to that is, in your opinion, what makes for a dignified and respectful human-animal relationship?
I had some wonderful quotes from Lori Gruen, because she wrote about this in her book, Ethics of Captivity. And I ultimately decided to not include them for time. I think it's worth noting, or one of the important points that she makes is that it's not, whether we decide how we process images and whether we view them as dignified or not dignified is dependent on how fellow viewers react to them, and not necessarily the person in the photo, how they feel. And that translates into animal photography. And by that, I mean that animals don't have that same concept of dignity, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't respect their dignity. And because how animals are represented in visual culture will shape or shapes how they are treated. And so that is an important reason why it's important to think about how animals are photographed and whether the representations of animals is respectful to who they are. As far as whether you, like, how you know when it's dignified and how you don't know, I mean, I shared the Wegman image. You know, there could be in fact, there is a whole lecture in my mind on examples of ethically problematic work. I think that the bigger question is to think about when you're looking at an image, think about the photographer's intention. Think about whether the animal is treated as an individual and respected. And think about also how the images are being used. And I think those three things can drive some of the considerations around whether the dignity of the animals in these images is respected.
Hi, thank you so much. So this, you kind of partially answered this with the last question, but more broadly, you're saying how you try to capture animals, or I guess capture is not the right word, but
There's the
portray
language again. Yeah.
portray
See, it's
animals,
hard.
yeah, as like sentient but not anthropomorphic. And I'm wondering as how you as a photographer kind of see your own limits of understanding animals' personalities, or you as a human, kind of where the limits on you understanding them are, I guess.
So that's an excellent question. I have to say that as an undergrad, I did study animal behavior. I was a psych major. I focused on neurobiology and cognitive psych, but I did study animal behavior, animal learning and behavior. So I suspect that even though that was decades ago, I suspect that that partly informed how I approached being with the animals, how I approached photographing them, and how I interpret their facial expressions and body language. But, you know, Carl Safina has a brilliant book, Beyond Words, that I highly recommend, that talks about all the various ways that we try to deny the existence of animal emotions. And at one point he bluntly says, you know when your dog has to go to the bathroom, you know when your dog is hungry, you're not wondering, gee, how do I interpret that? And he also makes the point that we have inherited animal emotions from an evolutionary standpoint. If we inherited other aspects, lungs, heart, skeletal system, why wouldn't we inherit animal emotions? And so animal emotions are human emotions. We are animals. And as far as how to interpret them, I think animals, particularly domesticated animals, are really good at communicating their wants, their dislikes. I've always hated, as an activist, the expression "voice for the voiceless," because animals can communicate their wishes very clearly. It's just humans that are often ignore what they're saying. And as far as whether the whole debate about whether animals do have emotions, there's been a lot of scholarship in the last decades. When I was in college, there was this kind of this disdain for anthropomorphism. It was like the third rail, and that has changed a lot in the fields of animal learning and ethology, for example. There is one other note, and I don't remember the actual study, but Mark Bekoff, who has written numerous books about animal emotions, he cited a study about how humans generally are actually good at interpreting animal body language and facial expressions. You don't have to be a trained scientist to interpret that. If you've ever lived with a companion animal, you know when they're excited, when they're sad, when they're upset. You know, it's not a mystery. And one final note on this is, it's true that we can never know what animals are thinking, but that is the case also for your friends and your partner. And you can never know what anyone is thinking, but you can rely on what you've observed in your relationship with these people. And the same is true with animals, non-human animals.
Thank you, Isa, for a very thought-provoking and moving presentation. I have a question about what you said at the beginning of your talk. You said that this project was created out of your fear of death and fear of aging. And I was wondering, how has your feeling towards death and aging evolved through the process? And have you learned anything from observing the animals to help you cope with it?
Yeah, you know, I did. It was important to me that I not project my emotional baggage onto these photographs and onto the animals that I was photographing. So I would clear my head before entering an enclosure and spending time with the animals. But you know, there were occasions when you know, I couldn't help but think of my mom. You know, there was a blind turkey named Gandalf that I photographed at Pasado Safe Haven, and it was a sweltering hot day. Gandalf was blind. He had a blank stare in his eye. One of his eyes was missing, but one of his remaining eye had a blank stare, and it was swelteringly hot. And turkeys breathe through their mouths, through their beaks when they're hot. And so his gaping mouth, his blank stare, it brought me right back to being at my mom's bedside when she was catatonic. And I left his enclosure in tears. And it took several times for me to visit him, spend time with him, observe him, in order to be able to see Gandalf as the individual that he was and not see my mom. As far as my fear of aging goes, I'm still rather concerned about developing dementia. But one thing that I will say is that being around these rescued farm animals who defied all odds to reach old age, I mean, it really is a miracle to be in the presence of a rescued farm animal who's reached old age. I mean, it's just so incredibly rare. And you know, it helped me appreciate that aging isn't always a curse. It can be a blessing. And the resilience and dignity that these animals exhibited in their old age inspires me. And I hope that I experience my old age half as well as they have. So.
Thank you. So we have time for one last brief question, and this is coming from Maggie. In the future, how do you see your photographic work continuing? Will farm animals continue to be your focus?
Yeah, so I definitely plan on continuing that work. My next project, I actually want to photograph animals at birth and the early bonding between mom and babies, which is so often denied animals on commercial farms. In the dairy industry, for example, babies are taken from their moms quite early, because the milk is that is intended for the babies, is used for human consumption, and it's a traumatic process of separating the babies from the mother. For example, mothers don't have natural interactions with their babies on commercial farms. For example, sows are kept in these gestation crates where they can't even move around and interact with their babies in a natural way. So just as old age is denied farmed animals, so too is motherhood. So I want to photograph that as a way of, again, showing what is missing. I think also as a spin-off for that project, what I want to do is return to the sanctuaries when the baby animals reach slaughter age, to show that these animals are just babies when they're slaughtered. Most aren't even 6 months old. So that's going to be the next work. That was pre-pandemic, and there are a lot of logistical challenges with the idea of photographing the births and these early interactions. There is respecting the privacy of the animals, and that's something that I really want to. I'm going to have to think a lot about how to do it in an ethical way. And then there's also just the sheer logistics of getting notified. I refuse to photograph animals on commercial farms, and births aren't that common at sanctuaries. So I anticipate getting a call or an email 72 hours before birth, if I have even that much time, and having to get on a plane or in a car to photograph. So I'm still kind of working out the ethical considerations, the creative considerations, and the logistical considerations of that work. But that's what I want to do next.
Thank you so much, Isa, and we'll be avid readers. So please join me in thanking Isa for this talk. And also, please join us next week, October 14th, for the third in our weekly series of Artists Talk on environmental art. And we will be featuring a conversation between Native artists Erin Genia and Elizabeth James Perry. The title of the discussion is Public Art, Native Art Expressions, and Ecological Thinking. And the Zoom link for that session is in the chat. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.